The moment her own brother offered her to the Winter Alpha King as a worthless tribute, Verity's life ended. She was the quiet one, the sister of the ambitious Pack Alpha Loric, a woman known more for her herb lore and mending skills than for any notable beauty or strength. He was Thane, the Alpha of the North, a man said to be carved from the very ice and iron of his mountain kingdom, his heart frozen by a decade of war. Her brother offered her up with a dismissive wave, a trinket to sweeten a treaty he desperately needed. But what her brother didn't know, what no one in the Great Hall could possibly understand, was that the Alpha's wolf had just scented its mate for the first time in a century of waiting. If you believe that the one who is cast aside can become the one who is chosen, type chosen below and let me tell you what happened next. To understand how she got there, you need to know about the silence. Verity's life was built on it. She moved through her brother's hall like a ghost. Her footsteps softened on the rushes, her voice rarely rising above the crackle of the hearth fire. She was useful, of course. Her hands could set a bone, stitch a wound that would fester under another's care, and brew a sleeping draught that could calm the most troubled spirit. But usefulness was not the same as being seen. Her brother, Loric, was all noise and ambition. He had taken control of the Sunstone Pack after their father's passing, his rule defined by loud pronouncements and grand gestures. He sought alliances, he craved recognition, and he saw Verity as little more than a part of the fortress's masonry, functional, present, but utterly unremarkable. The wound of his dismissal was a quiet ache she had carried for years, a constant, low thrum beneath her ribs. He was her blood, her alpha, and he saw nothing in her worth acknowledging. Then came the northern delegation. They arrived not with the clamor of war, but with the chilling quiet of a coming blizzard. At their head was Alpha King Thane of the Winterfang Pack. He was a legend, a creature of myth as much as a man. Stories told of him taking the northern hold with only 50 warriors, of his howl freezing the blood of his enemies. He was tall, broader than any man Verity had ever seen, with hair the color of ash and eyes that were a pale, piercing silver, like chips of ice. He moved with an unnatural stillness, a predator's economy of motion that made every other man in the hall seem clumsy and loud. When he entered, the boisterous warmth of Loric's great hall seemed to drop by 10 degrees. A heavy silence fell, broken only by the spitting of the fire. Thane's presence was a physical weight, a pressure against the chest. He did not speak of peace, he spoke of terms. His voice was low, a gravelly rumble that seemed to come from the very stones of his mountain home. The negotiations had lasted for 2 days. Loric postured and boasted, while Thane watched him, his silver eyes unblinking, his expression unreadable. He conceded nothing. By the 3rd evening, Loric was desperate. The treaty was vital, the northern border was a constant threat, and Thane's warriors were relentless. Verity was serving mulled wine, her movements quiet and efficient as always. She kept her eyes down, her focus on the heavy pitcher and the pewter cups, trying to make herself smaller, to fade into the tapestries on the wall. She could feel Thane's gaze on her, but she dismissed it. Men like him did not look at women like her. His attention was likely just a predator's habit, scanning the room for threats, for weaknesses. She was refilling a cup near the high table when her brother's voice rang out, slick with false generosity. "To seal our pact, Alpha King Thane," Loric announced, his arm sweeping out in a grand gesture. "I offer you a ward from my own house, a permanent guest in your hold, to ensure our lasting faith." A murmur went through the hall. A hostage. It was an old custom, but a brutal one. Verity's heart stuttered. Who would he send? One of the lesser lord's daughters, perhaps? Loric's eyes found her. A cruel, dismissive smile touched his lips. My sister, Verity. She is quiet and skilled with herbs. She will not be a bother to you. He said it as if offering a well-behaved hound. He was not honoring Thane. He was ridding himself of a piece of furniture he no longer had a use for. The humiliation was a physical blow. It struck the air from her lungs, and for a moment, the hall tilted. All eyes were on her. She saw the pity, the scorn. She was being discarded like a worn-out cloak. Her own brother was handing her to the Winter Alpha as a thing of no value, a token so insignificant its loss would mean nothing. The wound he'd been carving into her for years was just ripped wide open for the whole world to see. She straightened her back, the pitcher still in her hand, and forced herself to meet the gaze of the man at the high table. She expected to see cold indifference, perhaps even contempt. Instead, what she saw stole her breath. Alpha King Thane was looking at her, truly looking. His inhuman stillness had shattered. He was leaning forward slightly, his massive shoulders tense. His silver eyes were no longer chips of ice. They were blazing, a molten, luminous silver that seemed to burn away the shadows in the hall. A low sound, a growl too deep for a human throat, vibrated in his chest, a sound that the rest of the hall might have mistaken for a murmur of assent. But Verity felt it. She felt it in the stone floor beneath her feet, in the very marrow of her bones. It was a sound of pure, possessive recognition, and beneath the scent of pine smoke and cold iron that clung to him, she smelled something else, something wild and ancient, like winter earth and ozone before a storm. It called to a part of her she never knew existed, a deep, slumbering thing that stirred in her blood for the first time. His wolf knew her, and in that single shattering moment, the world shifted on its axis. Thane rose to his feet. The movement was fluid, silent, and utterly commanding. He dwarfed her brother, dwarfed every man in the room. The power rolling off him was immense, a physical force that silenced every whisper, every shuffling foot. I accept your offer, he said, his voice a low thunder that carried to every corner of the hall. His blazing silver eyes never left Verity's. He wasn't speaking to Loric. He was speaking to her. Loric let out a relieved, triumphant laugh, oblivious to the storm gathering in the Northern Alpha's gaze. He gestured for Verity to step forward. Excellent. She will gather her things. No. Thane's voice cut through the air, sharp and absolute. She will come now, with nothing. The words were a command, but also a declaration. He was not taking a ward. He was not accepting a tribute. He was claiming something. The way he looked at her was not the look of a king accepting a political pawn. It was the look of a wolf who has just found the one thing in the world that belongs to him. Verity's feet felt rooted to the floor. Fear warred with a strange, unfamiliar flicker of something else. Hope? Defiance? For the first time, someone was looking at her and seeing something. Not a mender, not a nuisance, not a ghost in the halls. A person, a prize. She placed the pitcher carefully on a nearby table, her hands surprisingly steady. She would not give her brother the satisfaction of seeing her tremble. She walked forward, past the rows of stunned faces, her head held high. She stopped before the dais, before the mountain of a man whose gaze felt like a physical touch, a brand against her skin. He held out a hand to her. It was huge, calloused from war and weather, But his gesture was not rough. It was an invitation. She placed her small, herb-stained hand in his. The moment their skin touched, a jolt went through her, hot and sharp as lightning. It was not just a spark of attraction. It was a current of pure energy, a shock that lit up every nerve in her body. A warmth flooded her, chasing away the chill of the hall, the deeper chill of her brother's rejection. Heat radiated from his palm, sinking into her bones, a primal heat that had nothing to do with the hearth fires. His fingers closed around hers, a possessive, gentle cage. His thumb stroked over her knuckles once, a small, deliberate movement that felt more intimate than any embrace she could have imagined. His silver eyes softened for a fraction of a second, the molten glow banking into something deeper, something that looked almost like relief. "She is mine now," Thane stated, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of an unbreakable vow. He looked over her head at Loric, and the ice returned to his gaze, colder and harder than before. "The treaty is sealed. We ride at dawn." He did not release her hand. He kept her anchored to his side as his men began to move, preparing for their departure. Verity was swept up in his wake, a small boat caught in the pull of a great warship. He led her from the great hall, away from the life she had known, away from the brother who had just cast her away without a second thought. The journey north was a blur of biting wind, snow-dusted pines, and the rhythmic thunder of hooves. Thane had placed her on his own massive warhorse, seating her in front of him. His body was a wall of heat and solid muscle at her back, shielding her from the worst of the wind. His arms were a cage around her, one hand holding the reins, the other resting lightly, possessively, on her hip. She should have been terrified. She was, in a way. She was the prisoner of a man known for his brutality, heading into a frozen, unfamiliar land. But the terror was a thin layer over something else, something deeper. The constant, solid presence of him behind her, the low rumble of his voice when he gave an order, the way his scent, pine, snow, and that wild animal musk, seemed to seep into her skin. It was not frightening. It was grounding. For the first time in her life, she felt tethered. She felt real. The constant heat radiating from him was a comfort against the encroaching cold, a silent promise of life in the midst of a dying landscape. He rarely spoke to her, but his presence was a conversation in itself. Every shift of his weight, every slight tightening of his arm around her, felt like a word spoken directly to her skin. They rode for days, climbing higher into the mountains, where the air grew thin and sharp, and the world was painted in shades of white and gray. Finally, they crested a ridge, and she saw it. The northern hold. It was not a castle. It was a fortress, carved into the very peak of a mountain, its stone towers like jagged teeth against the bruised twilight sky. It looked impregnable, unassailable, and utterly unforgiving. It looked like him. As they rode through the massive iron-bound gates into a torchlit courtyard, the silence of his people was as profound as his own. Warriors stopped their training, stable hands paused with their work, and women peered from doorways, their faces hard and weathered. They all stared at her, this small, plain woman tucked into their Alpha King's embrace. Their expressions were not welcoming. They were wary, suspicious. Thane swung down from the horse in one smooth, powerful motion, before turning and lifting her down as if she weighed nothing. He set her on her feet, but did not release her, keeping a hand on the small of her back, a clear gesture of possession to all who watched. He led her through vast, echoing halls of dark stone and ancient timber. The air was cold, scented with wood smoke and curing pelts. Unlike her brother's hall, which was always filled with noise and feasting, this place was quiet. It was the quiet of a wolf's den, a place of watchfulness and strength. He brought her to a set of heavy oak doors and pushed them open. The chambers within were large and Spartan, dominated by a massive stone hearth where a fire already blazed. A thick bed piled with furs stood against one wall, and a heavy wardrobe against another. A single window, tall and narrow like an arrow slit, looked out over a dizzying drop, a panorama of snow-covered peaks stretching to the horizon. "This will be your room," he said, his voice echoing slightly in the stone chamber. It was a cage, a comfortable, well-appointed cage, but a cage nonetheless. She was his prisoner, his tribute. The warmth she'd felt in his presence began to cool, replaced by the familiar chill of uncertainty. "Why?" The word was a whisper, but in the quiet room, it sounded like a shout. She turned to face him, forcing herself to meet his eyes. "Why me? My brother. He offered me as an insult. He thinks I am worthless. Why would you accept?" Thane closed the door behind them, the heavy thud sealing them in. He moved closer, and the room, which had seemed so vast, suddenly felt small, charged with his presence. He stopped a few feet from her, his silver eyes searching her face. The firelight flickered across the hard planes of his cheeks, making shadows dance in the hollows. "Your brother is a fool," he said, his voice a low growl. "He sits on a throne of gold and cannot recognize a diamond lying at his feet. He does not see what is right in front of him." "And what is that?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "What do you see?" He took another step, closing the distance between them. He was so close now, she had to crane her neck back to look at him. She could feel the heat rolling off his body, see the flecks of gold that ignited in his silver eyes. He lifted a hand, not to touch her, but to hover just beside her cheek, his fingers slightly curled, as if restraining a powerful urge. "I see what my wolf scented the moment I walked into that hall," he breathed, his voice rough with an emotion she couldn't name. "What he has been howling for since the first snows of his life. I see my mate." The word hung in the air between them, electric and terrifying and wonderful. Mate. The sacred, unbreakable bond. The one soul meant for another. It was a thing of legends, of songs sung by the fire, not something that happened to quiet healers and forgotten sisters. "That's impossible," she whispered, her mind reeling. "Is it?" he asked, his gaze intense. "Tell me you did not feel it when I touched you. Tell me you do not feel it now." She couldn't. The pull toward him was a physical force, an invisible cord tightening in her chest, drawing her closer. The ache that had settled in her heart was no longer just the sting of her brother's betrayal. It was a deep, resonant longing, a sense of rightness in his presence that defied all logic. "My wolf knew you on instinct," Thane continued, his voice dropping even lower, becoming more intimate. "But there is more. There is something in your blood, Verity. Something old and quiet, sleeping. A power tied to this land, to winter. It is why your scent is not of summer flowers, like the women of your pack, but of frost on pine needles, of the first snow. It is a scent of the north." He finally let his fingers touch her, his calloused thumb brushing against her jawline. The touch was electric, sending a shiver down her spine. Your brother was not just a fool to cast you aside. He was a blind man, throwing away the key to his own kingdom's strength. And there are others, enemies of mine, who would hunt you for what you are, for the power you don't even know you possess. They would use you or destroy you. His eyes held hers, fierce and protective. He handed you to me to be a prisoner. But you are not my prisoner. You are in my protection. This is not a cage. It is a sanctuary. Here with me, you will be safe until you are strong enough to understand what you are. The truth of his words settled over her, heavy as a fur cloak. He had not taken her as an insult. He had taken her to save her. He had seen not her weakness, but a strength she had never known was there. He had answered her brother's ultimate act of dismissal with the ultimate act of recognition. Would you have believed him when he claimed you were his mate and held a hidden power? Tell me in the comments, and if you are not subscribed yet, join this family. Verity looked around the stone room again. It no longer felt like a prison. The fire in the hearth seemed warmer, the furs on the bed more inviting. The window was not an arrow slit. It was a view of her new world, a world where she was not invisible. I will stay, she said, her voice clear and steady, and she knew in that moment she was not just agreeing to his protection. She was choosing this new life. She was choosing him. A small, defiant smile touched her lips. She would stay, not just for safety, but to discover this hidden part of herself. And perhaps a small part of her decided to one day show her brother exactly what a fool he had been. The days that followed were a slow, quiet unfolding. Thane was true to his word. She was not a prisoner. She was given the freedom of the hold, and while his people remained wary, their alpha's silent, constant nearness to her was a clear command to show respect. She found a routine. She explored the fortress's small but well-stocked library, finding old texts on herb lore that spoke of plants she'd only ever heard of in stories. Frost-kissed moonpetal and the root of the winter sleep tree. She spent time in the kennels, her quiet presence seeming to soothe the massive, half-wild wolves that served as the pack's hounds. They would whine and press their great heads into her hands, their amber eyes soft. The kennel master, a grim, scarred man named Kyle, watched her with grudging respect. "They don't take to outsiders," he grunted one afternoon, after a particularly large wolf had all but laid its head in her lap. "They smell the north on you." But the center of her new world was Thane. He was a constant, grounding presence. He would seek her out, finding her in the library or by the hearth in the evenings. They rarely spoke of the bond, but it was a living thing between them, a current in the air. They would sit in comfortable silence for hours. The only sounds the crackle of the fire and the whisper of the wind against the stone walls. He started bringing her things. One day it was a small, intricately carved wooden bird, its wings spread as if in flight. Another, it was a rare pale blue flower, preserved perfectly in a block of ice, that he said only grew on the highest, most inaccessible peak. They were not the grand gifts of a king wooing a lady. They were the quiet offerings of a wolf bringing treasures to its mate's den. One evening, she found him in the armory, sharpening a massive broadsword, the rhythmic scrape of stone on steel filling the cold air. An old, wicked-looking scar ran from his temple down his jaw, pale against his skin. She had seen it before, of course, but now, in the flickering torchlight, she felt a sudden urge to know its story. She approached quietly and took a seat on a nearby bench. He didn't stop his work, but his movements slowed, became more deliberate. He was aware of her every breath. "How did you get that?" she asked softly. He finally paused, resting the sword across his knees. He touched the scar, his expression distant. "A southern lord who thought a treaty was just a piece of paper. He tried to kill me in my sleep, during what was meant to be a parley. He learned that a wolf sleeps with one eye open." There was no boast in his tone, just a flat statement of fact. She saw past the hardened warrior then, past the fearsome Alpha King, and saw the man who had been betrayed, who had learned to trust no one. The man who had been alone for a very long time. Without thinking, she stood and walked to him. She reached out a tentative hand and gently traced the line of the scar with her fingertips. His skin was rough, but warm. He flinched, not away from her, but a sharp, involuntary tightening of his entire body, as if her touch was a shock. He went utterly still, his silver eyes closing for a moment. A low rumble started in his chest. "No one has ever touched it," he said, his voice thick. "It is a part of you," she whispered, her fingers lingering on his jaw. "It is a part of your story." He opened his eyes, and the raw vulnerability she saw there made her heart ache. The great, unbreachable fortress had a crack in its walls, and he was letting her see it. He captured her hand, turning his head to press a kiss into her palm. The touch of his lips was both rough and reverent. It sent a wave of heat through her entire body, a dizzying liquid warmth that pooled low in her belly. The pull of the bond was undeniable now, a constant, sweet ache that intensified whenever he was near. It was a hunger and a comfort all at once. She saw the same ache reflected in his eyes, the tight control he held over himself, the way his hands would clench at his sides when she walked past him. He was giving her time, letting her settle, but his wolf was impatient. Her own dormant power began to stir, faint whispers in her blood. Sometimes, when she was tending to the herbs in the small, glass-roofed garden at the top of the hold, she would touch a wilting leaf and feel a faint coolness spread from her fingertips, and the leaf would seem to revive, its color deepening. Once a hawk with a broken wing was brought in, a frantic, terrified creature. As she held it, murmuring softly, a light frost, delicate as spun sugar, formed on her hands, and the bird grew calm, allowing her to set the bone without a struggle. She was changing. The mountain was changing her. Or perhaps it was simply waking up what had been there all along. The timid, overlooked woman was fading, and in her place someone else was emerging. Someone quieter, but stronger. Someone who knew her own worth, not because a man had told her, but because she was beginning to feel it resonate within her own soul. The peace of their slow-burning world was shattered one moonless night. The warning came not as a horn blast, but as a scent on the wind. Verity was in her chambers, reading by the fire, when a smell unlike any from the north, the smell of damp earth, of summer leaves, of her old home, drifted through the window. With it came the metallic tang of shed blood, a howl ripped through the night, not from the kennels, but from the battlements. It was a sound of alarm. Before she could even rise, her door burst open. Thane stood there, no longer the quiet man who shared silent evenings with her. He was the Alpha King, the warrior. He was dressed in dark leathers, the sword she had seen him sharpening now strapped to his back. His silver eyes were burning, all trace of warmth gone, replaced by the lethal chill of a predator. "Stay here," he commanded, his voice a low, hard growl. "Bar the door. Do not open it for anyone but me." "What is it?" she cried, her heart pounding. Southerners, he snarled. They used a path even my own scouts did not know. They are inside the walls. He looked at her, and for a second, the warrior's mask cracked. They have come for you. He turned to leave, but she ran to him, grabbing his arm. No, I am not a prize to be hidden away. I am not the weak thing my brother threw away. Let me help. His gaze was fierce. Your place is to be safe. My place is with my mate, she said, the words coming from a place of pure instinct, a truth she hadn't even known she was ready to speak aloud. The words struck him like a physical blow. The fire in his eyes softened, warred with a desperate, protective urge. But he saw the steel in her spine, the fierce determination in her eyes. He saw the woman she was becoming. He gave a sharp, reluctant nod. With me, then, at all times. He pulled a long dagger from his belt and pressed it into her hand. The hilt was cold and heavy. You know how to use this. It wasn't a question. He knew she had learned more than just herbs in her quiet life. The sounds of fighting were echoing up from the lower levels of the hold now. Shouts, the clang of steel, the savage snarls of wolves. Thane led her out, his body a shield, moving with a terrifying speed and grace. His men were already engaging the intruders, a swarm of dark-clad figures who fought with a desperate ferocity. They were outnumbered, but they had surprise on their side. Thane moved through the battle like a force of nature. His sword was a blur of silver, his movements economical and deadly. He did not waste energy on flourishes. Every strike was a killing blow. The wolf was just beneath his skin, a feral grace in his fighting, a low growl, a constant undertone to the chaos. Verity stayed close behind him, her dagger held tight. She was not a warrior, but she was not helpless. When a southern fighter broke past Thane's guard, lunging for her, she reacted on instinct. She sidestepped, brought the dagger up in a vicious arc, and drove it into the soft spot under his arm. He gasped, falling back with a look of pure shock on his face. Thane turned, his eyes flaring with pride and terror all at once. He dispatched another attacker before pulling her tighter against his back. They fought their way toward the great hall, which seemed to be the epicenter of the attack. As they burst through the doors, Verity's blood ran cold. In the center of the hall, leading the invaders, was her brother. Loric stood there, clad in his own pack's battle leathers, his face a mask of smug triumph. "Brother," he called out to Thane, his voice dripping with mockery, "I have come to reclaim my lost property. You can have your treaty. Just give me the girl. She is a disgrace to my bloodline, shacking up with a northern savage." The insult was meant to sting, to provoke. But it was his presence here that was the true betrayal. He had not just cast her aside, he had allied himself with Thane's enemies, used their knowledge of the secret paths, all to attack the man he had just made a pact with. All to get her back, not out of care, but out of pride. She had become valuable to Thane, and so Loric could not stand it. "She is not your property." Thane's voice was dangerously quiet, a rumble of thunder before the storm breaks. "And you are no brother of mine. You are a traitor who brings war into my home." "She is my blood," Loric shrieked, his composure cracking. "She belongs to me." "No," Verity's voice rang out, clear and cold as the mountain air. She stepped out from behind Thane, her dagger still dripping. She met her brother's furious, disbelieving gaze. "I belong to no one but myself, and I choose to stand here." As she spoke, a strange coldness bloomed in her chest. Not the cold of fear, but the cold of power. The torches in the hall flickered as if hit by a sudden gust of wind. The air grew heavy, thick with the promise of snow. A delicate tracery of frost began to creep across the flagstones at her feet, spreading out from her in a silent, crystalline wave. Loric stared, his mouth agape. The southern warriors faltered, looking from her to the spreading ice. Thane's men, the men of the north, let out a collective, savage roar of approval. They recognized the power. They recognized their land's magic made manifest in their Alpha's mate. Thane looked down at her, not with shock, but with a fierce, burning pride. He saw her power, unleashed by her will, by her choice. He saw his queen. "You see, Loric," Thane said, his voice laced with deadly satisfaction. "I told you that you were a fool. You threw away the heart of winter itself." Enraged and humiliated, Loric charged. He was not aiming for Thane, he was aiming for her, but he never reached her. Thane moved with a speed that was not human. He intercepted his charge, not with his sword, but with his bare hands. He caught Loric by the throat, lifting him from his feet as if he were a child, the sound of cracking bones echoing in the sudden silence of the hall. The remaining southern warriors, seeing their leader defeated so utterly, lost their nerve. They broke, turning to flee, only to be cut down by the waiting Winterfang warriors. Thane did not kill Loric. He held him, choking and sputtering, and threw him to the ground at Verity's feet. Her brother lay there, gasping, defeated, looking up at her with eyes full of terror and disbelief. The man who had never seen her, who had deemed her worthless, was now helpless before her. She did not feel triumph. She felt a great, sad emptiness. She looked down at the man who was her blood, and she felt nothing but pity for his small, grasping soul. "Get him out of my sight," she said, her voice quiet, but imbued with an authority that no one in the hall dared to question. The fighting was over. The hold was secure. In the aftermath, standing in the center of the great hall, surrounded by his victorious warriors, Thane turned to her. The blood and chaos of the battle seemed to fade away, leaving only the two of them in a bubble of silence. He knelt. The Alpha King of the North, the victor of 100 battles, knelt before her on the frost-kissed stone floor. He took her hand, the one not holding the dagger, and pressed it to his cheek. "Verity," he said, his voice rough with emotion, his silver eyes glowing with a reverence that humbled her. "My mate, my queen." The old wounds, the years of being invisible, of being dismissed, finally healed. They were not just covered over. They were erased, burned away by the heat of his devotion, frozen over by the power that was her own. She was not the cast-aside sister. She was the heart of winter, and she was home. Months passed, melting into a year. Winter held the north in its firm, white embrace, but the fortress was a bastion of warmth and life. Verity was no longer a guest, a ward, or even just Thane's mate. She was the Luna of the Winterfang, a title she wore with a quiet grace that commanded more respect than any shouted order. Her power settled within her, no longer a startling phenomenon, but a part of who she was. The gardens flourished under her touch, producing herbs that could heal wounds in half the time. The pack wolves were her shadows, utterly devoted. She could calm a border dispute with a few soft words, her presence seeming to leach the heat of anger from the air. She was the balance to Thane's iron rule, the quiet snow that gentled the hard edges of the mountain. Her brother, Loric, had been sent back to the Sunstone Pack, disarmed and disgraced, with Thane's warriors as an escort. The story of his betrayal, of his sister's power, had preceded him. His pack, shamed by his weakness and treachery, had deposed him. He was an outcast now, living in the shadow of the reputation he had so desperately tried to build. Verity rarely thought of him. He was a ghost from a life that no longer felt like her own. One evening, she stood on the balcony of their chambers, the same one that had once seemed like the edge of a couch. The sky was a deep, star-dusted velvet, and the northern lights danced in shimmering veils of green and violet above the peaks. The air was so cold it felt sharp in her lungs, a clean, pure cold that she had come to love. She heard Thane approach from behind. He didn't speak, just came to stand beside her, his familiar warmth a welcome shield against the night's chill. He wrapped an arm around her, pulling her back against his chest, and she leaned into his solid strength, her head resting on his shoulder. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the celestial display. "Do you ever miss it?" he asked, his voice a low rumble against her ear. "The sun? The warmth of the south?" She considered it for a moment, thinking of the green hills and warm rains of her former home. "I miss the sun sometimes," she admitted, "but I was always cold there." He tightened his hold, understanding her meaning perfectly. She had been cold from the inside out, chilled by loneliness and a lack of love. Here, in the heart of the endless winter, she had never been warmer. She turned in his arms to face him, her hands coming up to cup his jaw. The scar was just a faint silver line now, familiar and dear to her. His eyes, in the faint light, were soft, filled with a deep, abiding love that still, after all this time, had the power to take her breath away. "You saw me, Thane," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "When no one else did. Not just with your eyes. Your wolf, your soul. You saw me." "Always," he murmured, leaning down to capture her lips in a kiss that was both gentle and fiercely possessive. It tasted of winter and wood smoke, of promises kept and a love as vast and wild as the northern lands themselves. "My wolf knew you from the start. It just took my heart a moment to catch up. For more stories where quiet strength conquers arrogant pride, and where being truly seen becomes the greatest power of all, subscribe to His Wolf Knew First. So tell me, would you have stayed? Comment where you are listening from tonight. I stay up until my eyes burn to bring you these stories. If this one touched you, do not break my heart. Subscribe and I will see you in the next one.